I want to mention that book and that time because now we're in what you call the pandemic recession. You say it's hard to model, it has no precedent, and already people said V-shaped recovery, then a W, then every other letter in the alphabet. And with the virus still active and people see no vaccine, they're starting to recalibrate their expectations for growth, for what they're wanting to call a recovery. What do you see?
So even back in March, Kathleen, I was highlighting that this crisis being driven by the disease is very difficult to predict how long it would last. But my expectations back then was that its impact would be long-lived. This did not start as a financial crisis, but it is morphing into a major economic crisis with very serious financial consequences.
Is there a risk that it's going to morph into? Is there a risk it's going to morph into any kind of financial crisis? A big topic this week, a big issue for the World Bank, the suspension of debt payments for the world's poorest nations. Do you see any dots to connect between what's happening there and what could happen more broadly?
Absolutely. So the World Bank, of course, had called for a longer extension, for a year extension. As it stands, it's going to be an extension of 6 months to be reconsidered if it needs to be extended longer at the next annual meetings. The connection is that financial frailties, debt frailties, in many cases, many of those were there already, have become manifest. And the longer the uncertainty, the longer the pandemic works its way through the global economy, the bigger the balance sheet damage. Corporates, households, banks, and certainly sovereigns. And for the poorest countries, I think there are dire needs that are very imminent. About half of the lowest income countries are already in debt distress or approaching debt distress. This is where we are already.
Now, you've warned of an unprecedented surge in debt crises. You're also concerned about banks that have once again become over-leveraged. You put India on that list. How big is the risk? I mean, it seems like, well, if it's the poorest nations, yes, it's terrible, but it's a smaller part of the economy. Again, what is the vulnerability of banks that could spread from one to another, particularly in emerging markets?
So, look, Kathleen, I've been highlighting, and the World Bank has published an amazing report on poverty. This has been a very regressive crisis. It's hit the poorest within countries and across countries. So the vulnerabilities in the lower income countries and in emerging markets is much greater at the moment than for the advanced economies. What are the global consequences of that? Don't forget, Kathleen, and we had these conversations back around the 2008-2009 crisis, that emerging markets turned out to be the bright spot of that crisis, led by double-digit China growth. That is certainly not happening here. This is truly a global crisis.
Is there a risk that this economic pandemic crisis turns into some kind of financial crisis in some part of the world?
Yes, absolutely. And I have called it the quieter crisis because at the moment, as you know, across the globe, many either by law or voluntarily, banks also have put in suspension, have granted grace periods to households and businesses in the repayment of their loans. Now, when the dust settles, some of those loans are not going to be repaid. And I would venture to say a significant number, because we are seeing output declines and already signs of building bankruptcies that are likely to have big consequences for bank balance sheets. Can it spread? Well, most certainly it can spread, but I would highlight that even without cross-border contagion in the classic financial sense, you are getting a simultaneous hit in that, you know, the downturn has been very synchronous, and a lot of the balance sheet problems would also likely be in varying severity, but also quite synchronous. So that is a risk looming ahead.
China, our Bloomberg economics team took a look at the data from the IMF showing what was the headline a couple of days ago, China, the only major economy that's going to expand this year. They extrapolated from that to determine that there's going to be an ever greater role, a bigger part of China's economy driving the global economy by the year, I believe, 2025, from something like 27% in 2021 up to about 28 or 29%. Has the pandemic given China a kind of a permanent boost?
Well, its share in global GDP is poised to rise as you flagged. Now, I would highlight, however, that China went into the 2008-2009 crisis and continued for some time thereafter, growing at double digits, which had enormous positive consequences for the developing world, you know, strong commodity prices from their strong global demand. While the share of Chinese global GDP is poised to continue to rise, I don't think that engine of growth factor that it played in the emerging world is going to replay now. And certainly during that time, China's lending, overseas lending, especially to low-income countries, really soared. And that also is not playing out right now, or likely to in the coming years, because those very same countries that borrow from China are now, many of them, mired with significant debt overhangs. And hence the focus, a big focus of the annual meetings this year is what to do beyond the DSSI. How do we go about helping these countries restructure their debt? And faster is better than a replay of the 1980s, to be sure.
If China's in such a strong position economically, then why are they not participating in the debt suspension relief that just got extended this week? You would think that among all the countries out there and all the hedge funds, that they'd be in an excellent financial position to do that. It seems, it's been pointed out, it's a big problem for this whole effort to shore up these countries with debt relief.
So the DSSI effort has met two major hurdles. One is China has participated, but less than fully. The China Development Bank, a major lender to the developing world, has yet to participate. Also, private sector creditors have yet to participate. And many, you know, during the boom years, many of the lower income countries were also frontier markets borrowing from the private sector. So full participation is something that we should strive for, but have not yet, unfortunately, seen.
I want to ask you about a bigger question, I guess, about central banks fighting the pandemic, doing everything they can, rates near zero, buying lots of bonds. But is buying bonds to keep your yields low while your government sells a whole bunch of them, and of course you help buy them, is that ultimately a zero-sum game if every government in the world is doing it?
Look, we are still in the dimension of what I call fighting the war, Kathleen. You know, this is a war. During wars, government finance their war expenditures however they can. And right now there are dire needs, as we've been discussing. If you extrapolate, however, that this can continue, I think that's not a scenario. The scenario we are in is not a sustainable one. And especially, I think, you know, some of the very welcome quantitative easing that we've seen in emerging markets, which is a first, the scope for that being sustained going forward, I think, is more limited than perhaps many enthusiasts think.
want to give it a quick follow on that question because you led right into what I was wondering. If emerging markets have to compete with big, more, developed, stronger countries, will they have to sell their debt at ever higher yields? And is that going to help push them into taking on yields that become risky?
So Kathleen, you've hit on an excellent point. I mean, there's been quite a bit, after the big scare in March and in April, there's been sort of this sigh of relief that, oh, countries have market access. And indeed, many emerging markets in developing countries have had market access, but you begin to question at what price? And issuing debt at 8%, 9%, and as high as 9.5%. What kind of growth do you need to be able to sustain that? So that is another cause for concern, that a lot of the market access is extremely pricey and undermines the debt sustainability of some of these borrowers.
Well, looking down the road, but even not so far down the road, because as your debt and deficit is rising, countries are looking at how they're going to finance, how to manage that debt. And of course, Joe Biden, for example, on the campaign trail, maybe let's tax high earners. France just this week said it's going to start taxing some of its social media companies again. And in fact, the Philippines, we just spoke to the Philippines Finance Secretary, Sonny Dominguez, and that's one of the things they're looking at potentially is some taxes on these kind of richer high-tech companies that have done well during the pandemic. How is this going to play out, Carmen? Is this going to be a plus? Is this going to be a drag?
Look, I think, unlike World War II, unlike a war, the expenditures that we're seeing are not military expenditures that can be quickly reversed as they were when the war ended in 45. So the need to look for new revenue sources to support social needs is going to be, I think, a very pressing one moving ahead. And this really cuts across, as you highlighted with your examples, across all regions in varying degrees and across all income strata. I think that the outgrowth of the very large budget deficits, the very big debt buildups, is going to move governments towards a higher seeking a variety of higher revenues, whether it's through tax increases or widening the base or a combination of the two things.